Psych Perspectives GeoFox. I also want to bring up how the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the changes essentially destroying the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with the new interpretations from the conservative majority U.S. Supreme Court that were appointed by Donald J. Trump, the president, during his first term. So, not only does it disenfranchise black voters, but it also disenfranchises black voters and black representation to the U.S. Congress and political elected positions and seats in general. It also is impacting people of color, Latinos, Hispanics, Asians, Pacific Islanders, indigenous people. It's also going to impact women, girls, LGBTQ plus people. It's impacting marginalized groups, minority voters, marginalized voters. So the reason I'm bringing this up, because the other article that I want to share with you is from The Guardian. What is the U.S. Supreme Court's voting rights ruling about, and how is it going to impact you during the election process, during the midterms that are coming up in the U.S.? So just to let you know again, a 6-3 right-wing conservative justices, 6 of them, who control America's top court, ordered Louisiana to redraw congressional maps that gave African Americans the chance to elect their candidates of choice proportionate to their population size. The majority dismiss this as an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. Meanwhile, the entire country is racially gerrymandered to the benefit of white folks. I'm calling a thing a thing. Y'all want to really sit up here and completely negate history and what's been going on for centuries in this God-forsaken country, on this land that once again was stolen and infiltrated by Europeans, from people from the continent of Europe, white people. And also, let's just keep it a buck. You stole the land. You killed off and genocide entire tribes of people, indigenous people. In the U.S., you say Native Americans. But you murdered and killed and also pushed people out, and it's... History matters. Politics matter. All right. So how is this, what is this ruling all about? At face value, Louisiana versus Calais focuses narrowly on Louisiana's congressional map. Lawmakers abiding by existing law had drafted maps that included 2 majority black districts out of 6, roughly proportionate to the state's population, which is 1/3 African American. A group of white voters sued, arguing that drawing maps specifically based on race was unlawful discrimination under the U.S. Constitution. And of course, the Supreme Court, which, okay, if you look at it from face value, it is unconstitutional, right? Hold on, right? But also, taking away people's representation of majority black areas is also discrimination and unconstitutional. And it's all about how you interpret the law, which is another problem with a lot of these things. It's left up to people's interpretation. But okay, the ruling dramatically changes the terms of key provisions that were already in place in the Voting Rights Act under Section 2, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. From now on, a state maps can only be challenged where it can be shown that there was intentional racial discrimination. That is a very difficult standard to prove, and one that Congress has for almost half a century specifically avoided. In a 1-2 punch, the ruling also says that race may no longer be considered when proposing alternative maps. Viewed from the larger arc of American history, Wednesday's ruling is vast. In effect demolishes a final pillar of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which for decades has been used to safeguard the political power of Black and other minority voters. It is the last serious blow to the Voting Rights Act to come from the U.S. Supreme Court's conservative majority, stretching back to Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. The court has piecemeal eviscerated a legendary statute that was passed in 1965 following years, decades, a century plus, really, bloody struggle, and has been held the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. I'm going to say it again. My grandparents are baby boomers. My grandfather, may he rest in peace, he passed in 2015. But they were born in the mid 40s. So my granny, 1945, my grandfather, 1946. So when people are talking about how this was a long time ago, it hasn't been a long time ago. 1965, my granny was 20 years old. My grandfather was 19. So it is not that long ago. My granny is 81, almost 81 and a half today. So when people try to make it seem like this was so long ago, it really wasn't. Really wasn't. And 1965 was 61 years ago. My mom is 55, almost 56. So that's why I'm like, we got to stop acting like this was that long ago. 1965 is Gen X. Would have been one of the first years of Gen X. So it's not that long ago, people. So when people bring that up, I'm always like, what? But to continue on with this, for decades, Section 2 has acted as a central shield for minority voters in largely southern states that have relentlessly resisted granting them equal political influence. Until Wednesday's ruling, the law could be invoked to block maps that had the effect of depriving Black voters of proportionate electoral power. Now that protection has been stripped from them, under the new ruling, anyone challenging a state's map will have to prove that the lawmakers were motivated by a desire to racially discriminate against minority voters, and not just by a wish to gain partisan party political advantage. That requires disentangling race from party reference, which is virtually impossible given the enduring loyalty of Black voters to the Democratic Party. And honestly, one of the reasons why a lot of Black people became Democrats was because of how they were being treated by society. And also under JFK, under President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Because at the time, you got to remember, you had Dr. Martin Luther King, you had Rosa Parks, you had SNCC, you had Malcolm X, you had so many people, key organizations, and just community members and individuals in general that were fighting for civil rights, which is what we call social justice today. But these are civil rights. That's how we got. They were working with elected officials, with community activists, with individual people and community members, with the faith and religious organizations, churches, and what have you as well. It was a collaborative effort for civil rights, social justice. So I just want to bring that up. According to the Pew Research Center, 83% of Black voters favor the Democratic Party across the U.S., a proportion that is even higher in the South. Under the new ruling, all states need to do is insist that their maps are designed with partisan politics in mind, and they will in fact be immune from challenge on grounds of racial discrimination. Now, as I stated in the other video, there's many potential outcomes to this because of this rule. In theory, there can be other ways. So one other potential aspect of this is, in theory, because of the new interpretations of Section 2 of the 1965's Voter Act, predominantly Democratic states could also do the same thing. So technically, places like California, New York, what have you, could literally redistrict their maps as well in their favor, since we know what's likely going to be the potential outcome in the South, which has already been going on, because even in large areas, Louisiana, literally a third of that state is black. Yet when you look at how the elections at the local, state, and federal level for Louisiana is typically going to be Republican, this has already been happening. Right? Like their representation was already being suppressed. Like Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, a lot of our southern states. And also, if you look back and you look at who supported the Voting Rights Act originally of 1965, it was those same states that didn't support it. So go figure, 61 years later, it's those same states that don't support it. Are we surprised? Are we really surprised here? History repeats, y'all. But I want to bring up, this is going to be impacting not only black voters and representation, but minority, marginalized voters and representation in general. Okay. But to bring it back to the reason of the Voting Rights Act and the history of it, the Voting Rights Act emerged from the struggles of the civil rights movement as a means of combating the virulent racial discrimination that festered under Southern Jim Crow laws, segregation. The statute sought to fulfill the promise of the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that granted freed enslaved people the right to vote. Until the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, the amendment was stymied by a slew of legislative tricks that disenfranchised African Americans from literacy tests to poll taxes, keeping them out from voting. Not to mention, there was physical violence, straight up domestic terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan with collaboration of the police, of the local police forces in southern states. Okay, collaboration with state representatives that were racist. Just being straight up, like, let's just keep it real. People were being killed, murdered, shot, hung from trees, thrown off bridges, drowned. It was a lot going on. It was straight up intimidation by violence, death, force, and legislative. History repeats because people don't learn. People refuse to acknowledge history as well. So, history, y'all, politics, this stuff is important, it has value, and it impacts our everyday lives, y'all. It is unlikely that the country will return to the most extreme forms of discrimination that proliferated in those dark days, But as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Kagan put in her dissent, the Voting Rights Act is now all but dead, leaving black and other minority voters exposed. They are once again at the whim of Republican leaders, free to revive age-old practices in map drawing, such as a colorfully named cracking and packing. Such measures are likely to diminish the electoral representation of minority Americans with it their political voice. And of course, we love to talk about how we won't go back. Oh, that's not going to happen. That's not possible. Yet we're literally living in it. They took away bodily autonomy from women and girls and people who have the capabilities of becoming pregnant and giving birth with Roe versus Wade. They've been rolling back rights and freedoms and attacking the U.S. Constitution and restructuring entire amendments to fit their perspective, their view of it, their interpretation of it. We're watching it happen. So I again, when you think about that, I'll put it like this. When you look at people of color, whether you're black, if you're a black person, African American, Haitian, Jamaican, Ghanaian, Dominican, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, if you're a woman, if you're transgender, if you're LGBTQ+, if you're disabled, if you're poor, because like I said, when you look at who originally could vote in the USA, it was white cisgender men who had land, had property. So in other words, you had to be, excuse me. In other words, you had to own property to be able to vote. You have to have wealth to be able to vote back in the day. And people keep trying to act like that's not. So again, if you were poor, you were not white, you weren't a man, you didn't have money, you didn't own property, you didn't have land, you couldn't vote. So that's why I'm like, this stuff is real. This is not a joke. This is not a game. And I'm tired of folks downplaying the severity of what's going on. Anyways, information is in the description box below.